said, "The season for failure is the best time for sowing the seeds of success." Raise your hand if you've ever experienced failure in your life. Very good. The truth is we all have, haven't we? But have you ever looked at your life and felt like this was it? Like this was all you'll ever become and all you'll ever achieve? That no matter how hard you work to set goals for yourself, that something always comes up and gets in the way of you accomplishing those goals. How many times has that happened to you in your life? Madam Contest Master, fellow Toastmasters, and all you failures out there. Tonight, I'd like to share my story with you about the few times in my life where I felt like a failure. You see, it wasn't long ago that I was frustrated with myself. My wife and I had a baby, and we had brought him home for the first time, and I remember I was holding him and looking at him and just enjoying him. And I thought to myself, you know, Hector, I should be really happy right now. This should be a really happy time in your life right now. But for some reason, I couldn't help myself from feeling like I had missed my shot. Like somehow I had failed to become the person that I thought I'd be by now. Has it ever happened to you? Have you ever felt frustrated and disappointed with yourself? I was frustrated. And the problem was, I didn't know what to do about it. So I did what any rational and emotionally intelligent person would do. I called my mother. I said, "Mom, I'm frustrated." And of course, she said 4 words to me that completely changed the way I felt in that moment. She said, "You have the power." And what she meant by that was that you have the power to change your future. You see, up until that point, I had forgotten that my mother had used this ability to change the course of my life when I was young. You see, I was born in Brooklyn in the late 70s, during a time when New York City was at its worst. The streets were cold and dirty and filled with so much crime. Even roaches had bodyguards. Growing up in the city was tough. Most of the kids in my neighborhood didn't necessarily have someone to look up to. And although I was fortunate enough to have 2 parents that loved me and raised me as a child, when I turned 10 years old, my mother and father divorced, and I struggled to find a role model. When I turned 15, my mother recognized that I had succumbed to the negative influences of my life at the time. She was afraid that she might lose me. But my mother was strong, and she would encourage me. She would say things like, you know, your current circumstances don't have to dictate where and how you end up in life. She was the kind of person who believed that your future was not bound by the limitations of your past, and that you had the power to change the way you wanted your life to be. And I remember I had come home one night, after being gone for several days at a time without her consent, without my mother's knowledge of my whereabouts. And I walked into the house expecting to go upstairs to my room, the way I had done a half a dozen times before. But this time, when I walked into the house, something was different. This time, my mother was waiting for me. And before I could say anything to her, she pointed to the door and she said, "I need you to leave." I said, "But Mom, you don't understand. Let me explain myself." She said, "No, you don't understand, do you? I can't take this anymore. You have to go." And she turned around and she grabbed my suitcase and she made arrangements for me to live in Florida with my father. And I remember crying out to my mother. I remember feeling hurt and betrayed, and I said to her, "You're just going to send me away? You're going to give me up just like that?" And she turned around and she said something I'd never forget. She said, "I would rather give you up for now than lose you for good. That's why I'm doing this." Now, at the time, I didn't understand what my mother was trying to do for me. I didn't understand that she was using this power to change my future. And when I got to Florida the next day, I remember feeling lost and confused and unloved. And when I saw my father standing there in the airport waiting for me, the way I had just witnessed my mother waiting for me hours before, I couldn't help but think of my mother and all the pain that I had put her through. And as a result, I started to cry. Because in that moment, I felt like such a failure. And I don't know if my father could sense my despair. I don't know if he could tell that I was broken and ashamed, but he came from around the carousel and he grabbed me in his arms and looked me in the eyes and he said, who you were and what you did in the past is not as important to me as who you're becoming and what you'll accomplish in the future. And for the first time in my life, ladies and gentlemen, I felt like I could be more. How many of you here today feel like you could be more? Raise your hand. Go ahead and make some noise for me. Come on, somebody. I know that some of you may be in your season of failure right now. That maybe you've made some mistakes in the past that you wish you could take back. But I'd like to leave you with this concept that you could be, do, and have anything you want regardless of your past because you have the power to change your future. So the next time you find yourself feeling frustrated and discouraged and disappointed the way I was, I want you to do two things. Number one, I want you to call my mother. Because I know that she's going to tell you the same thing she told me, that you have the power. And number two, in the event that your season of failure seems too long or too cold and too bitter, I want you to take comfort and refuge in the fact that this is your season, that it doesn't belong to anyone else but you, which makes it the perfect time to make the changes in your life that you want to see in your future. So when you leave here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite you to go out there, gather your grains, and sow your seeds of success. You have the power, ladies and gentlemen. How will you use that power to change your future? And I'm contest master.